Yes, again, I say welcome, my friends, to another episode of Cut the Fat on the SosoBone Media Network, where we get down to the nitty gritty on the SosoBone Media Network. Now, the Grace Kennedy for a 35th annual public lecture will examine the impact of childhood trauma on social, cognitive, and emotional development as physical and behavioral health in adulthood, which of course we know come from childhood. And the lecture will also showcase evidence based strategies to foster healthier children, families, and community. My guest this day is none other than Professor Wendel Abel, OD, OJJP, consultant psychiatrist at the University of the West Indies, a man with many hats. And I must say this is one of, I think will be one of the most rewarding interview that will be presented to our diaspora. And I say this because our diaspora has been talking about anything and everything except mental health, while most of the things that we see that is happening is being blamed on mental health. So, Professor Abel, let me say welcome to the SosoBone Media Network.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here with you today.
I'm going to ask you some very personal questions just so people have understanding of who we're talking to, where we're coming from, so they understand the man where he is now. I'm going to ask you a question which I like to ask so that some of our alumni associations up here can start getting. What school did you go to?
Well, I went to, in terms of elementary school, I started out at the Duhaney Park Primary School,
Uh-huh.
and then which is off the Washington Boulevard. And
Mm-hmm.
then I went on to Wolmer's Boys School.
Oh my goodness, Wilmer's like Crystal.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
And in terms of my university education, I did my medical degree, my first degree at University of the West Indies. Then I went on to the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. So I want to
Mhm.
say hello to the people in Baltimore. You
Good.
treated me well. There I did my master's in public health. And then I came back to Jamaica and I completed my specialization in psychiatry. And in terms of working, I did work for a brief while in New York, but I realized that the USA was not for me. So I returned home, and I'm very happy I did. You may ask the question if I have any regrets. Absolutely none. I'm happy that I returned to Jamaica and that I've served this country. And I know there are lots of people in the diaspora who would probably like to be home, but for different reasons, they have to remain where they are.
Mhm.
But just want to remind us that wherever you are, just continue to provide service. Remember your country, because service to country is the greatest honor.
Yes, yes, yes. I mean, for that, we have all the kudos, I might say, in the world. So under that condition, we might say put up some arts to show that we love that. Okay. Yes, yes, yes. You know, yes, the fact is that there's so many of us are lining up to come home. Okay. And based on some of the things that we are happening in this country, we did, it's like me and Motley say down there in Barbados, first in line to give him a passport, give him a visa. Okay, because yes, Jamaica is becoming very attractive. Not
Again,
again, yes, and
you
so
know, you know, the truth is, I would say the entire Caribbean. And at the end of the day, I'm sure a lot of people are saying, thank God I have a home to return to. Thank God for home.
Yes,
And that is why, as a people, wherever we go, we should not say anything negative about our homes. Don't badmouth your country.
that home is like family. Okay,
That's correct.
some of us when we're healthy, we badmouth family, and then when we're sick, we start wonder where they are. Okay,
That's correct.
okay. Now, a couple of questions, that I hope will sort of answer some of um, our quest for knowledge when it comes to the presence of mental issues in our community or trauma. I say this because we have a negative attitude in the Caribbean and especially in Jamaica when long before we have iPhone with earbuds that you could put in your ear. If you see somebody walking down the street talking to themselves, you know, we, we said I'm on the mad.
Yeah.
Okay. So and now we have never had a good grasp for um deviant or diverse reactions in our community. And we normally, I would say, had the idea that it was a one size fit all. Okay. So from examination to driver's license to the other things that we come across, it was always one size fit all. That's how we were judged. So I'm going to ask this question pretty much. When it comes to trauma, could you try to explain to us what trauma is?
All right. When I'm talking about trauma, I'm talking about childhood trauma. And I'm not talking about meeting in an accident or something like that. I'm talking about trauma like abuse, physical abuse, um, in which a child gets up every morning and a parent or caregiver might be there saying to them, "You're worthless. You're not going to become anything in life." Or physical abuse where children um, are disciplined, and it happens in Caribbean society to the point where what we think is discipline is really abuse, where they're beaten
Mm-hmm.
until the skin cut and they begin to bleed, or they're emotionally abused. And and other forms of abuse like neglect, whether it's emotional neglect or physical neglect. I don't think I also touch on sexual abuse, where children are left with older relatives or younger relatives, and they're taken advantage of sexually, or it could be a stepfather living with a child in the
Mm-hmm.
home and he's actually having sex with that child. And let me tell you this. It's very important that we discuss these cases of trauma and abuse
Mm-hmm.
among the diaspora community, the community living outside the country,
Yes, yes.
because what many of many persons have been affected by trauma,
Mm-hmm.
um, who may be listening, who themselves are adults today, or where you see it pop up a lot when you migrate and you leave your children behind. Maybe it's your one daughter or your one son
Mm-hmm. Yes.
behind for somebody to take care of that child.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only years later you hear how that child was verbally abused, physically abused, and sometimes sexually abused,
Yes.
you know. And that is of important because migration itself sometimes set up children from abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes when they're left behind, and sometimes when they 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 join the parent in the new country, they join them and they realize when you come to New York or New Jersey or wherever, your mother, you are the only child for your mother. Now you come to New York and you realize she living with a man, yes?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe she has other children with this
Mm-hmm.
man. And the beginning, the children speak with the accent and they speak nice, and you come back from Port of Spain or um, Bridgetown or Kingston, Jamaica, or from the country, and you join your parents there, and you still talking um, in the in the using the dialect and so on,
Mm-hmm.
and that child is sometimes traumatized. They're sometimes bullied.
Mm-hmm.
That's another form of abuse that children experience. Um, Other forms of common forms of abuse are experiences that they have in the house, like having a parent who probably uses drug,
Mm-hmm.
gets up every day and is abusive towards the mother, or a family member who has a mental illness, or family member who has been incarcerated. A lot of children um, experience that when they come to the USA, for example, or wherever, and they realize father, mother, family member actually selling drugs, and they get locked up and they're out of the house. All of these things can be traumatic experiences for children. And interestingly, in the USA several years ago, a large study was done looking at trauma in children. They refer to trauma as adverse childhood experiences, ACEs,
Mm-hmm.
adverse childhood experiences. And they look at some of these things that I spoke about. They ask the adults in the study if they have had any of these experiences. And it's interesting what they found out. They
Mm-hmm.
found out that two-thirds, two out of every three persons who was asked in the interview, this is people living in the USA,
Mm-hmm.
actually admitted to an adverse childhood experience, trauma.
Yes. Yeah.
And what they also found is that a lot of these persons had more than one. So some people
Mm-hmm.
not only had physical abuse, they had verbal abuse, they had sexual abuse. They live in a home where mother was being beaten by father every day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the findings were interesting. What were some of these findings? They found that an exposure to trauma, to these adverse childhood experiences, affect your long-term health. And
Uh-huh.
when they look at some of the leading causes of death in the USA, they realize that an exposure to trauma actually was increase your risk of getting these conditions like heart disease, lung disease, cancer, and so on. But
Uh,
let me even go back to the children. What the studies have also shown is that the trauma, the thing is that children are very vulnerable. Their brains are not well developed, and they're
mm-hmm.
very vulnerable to trauma,
Mm-hmm.
and it impacts on the development of the child over their life course.
Uh-huh.
So you find that they have children who are exposed to trauma have problems in school.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So they may leave your home in Jamaica and join you in New York, and you realize that they're behind.
Mm-hmm.
And teachers say when they come to school, they're daydreaming or they're dazing away, and you think that is a child not interested in the classwork, yes? Or this child has come to join you, and you notice the child start to use drugs, or the child start to run away from the house.
Mm-hmm.
And you wonder, you say, but my child wasn't brought up like this when I left um, Jamaica or Trinidad or St. Vincent. This is not the child I left behind. And then later you find out that while you left that child behind, that child had trauma,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Or that child might have experienced the trauma right there where you live in that apartment or
Mm-hmm.
house in
Yep.
Queens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or in New Jersey or wherever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so yes, it affects their behavior because behavior is a language of trauma. When children are going through trauma,
Ah, yes.
they don't tell us. We see it in their behavior. And I'm appealing to parents when you see these behavioral problems. Don't attack the child and begin to ask what's wrong with this child. You need to ask the question, what is happening to my child? Right? Because a lot of times when you see these behavioral problems, you see the problems with them not learning in school, it's because of trauma. Yes? And that's why it's very important for us to talk about trauma because in Caribbean society,
Mm-hmm.
Jamaican society, we don't like to talk about these things.
No,
Um,
no, no.
even people themselves who may be listening to us, who might have experienced trauma as children growing up, they don't like to talk about it because it's shame and it's
Uh-huh.
secret. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
and you know it's painful. Especially if you had left your child back home and you find out that you left your child with the auntie and the auntie boyfriend was having sex with your 8-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
It's painful, it's shameful, it's hurting, yes? And you keep that in secrecy, you don't tell anybody. The child come to the States, the child living with you, keep it a big secret, and it begins to affect the child, their education, their performance in school, how they interact with other children. And then they will become teenagers. You notice they start use drugs,
Mm-hmm.
they start engaging early sex. They're sorry, they engage in high risk sexual behavior.
Mm-hmm.
They're getting aggressive. They're always involved in fights, joining gang. A
Uh,
lot of times, what is behind this is trauma. I tell you this, even the mere act sometime of leaving your children behind is traumatic.
oh yes.
Although
Oh
you had the
yes.
best intention, one patient I had told me that he was 6 years of age when his mother was going to the States. And all he knew was that one morning she packed her suitcase and she went into a car. And she told him that she will soon come back for him.
Oh boy.
And the
Yeah.
mother left. And he never heard from his mother until he was about 12, 13 years old. That thing, that experience was traumatic for him because that child experienced that as rejection and abandonment. It was traumatic. And then
Yes.
he was left behind in Jamaica to stay with his grandmother,
Mm-hmm.
right? And he was beaten and traumatized and cussed off and just verbally abused and so on. And he lived with that because the reality is that we carry this pain, we carry our trauma in our brains, in our souls, and our body. Yes. And
Yeah.
this affected this young man. And when he joined his mother in the States, of course, she realized that he started to cut himself.
Ah.
And she wondering, what is this?
Mm.
Child come America or come to the USA and is picking up the bad habits that he's seeing there.
Mm-hmm.
But when we see our children engage in these behaviors, risky behaviors like cutting or attempting suicide, a lot
Mm-hmm.
of times what is behind all of that is trauma,
Oh yeah.
right? It's a pain that they're carrying that is buried in their body that they're trying to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And so this lecture is being done to, to lift our awareness and understanding of trauma so that we can recognize it when it occurs. But most importantly, when we recognize it, for us to be able to intervene, but better still, for us to be able to prevent it from
Mm-hmm.
occurring. I'm not judging, I'm not condemning the people who have migrated because a lot of times they do that with the best of intention
Yes.
to carve out a better life, not only for themselves, but for the children and
Mm-hmm.
their entire family. But sometimes, a lot of times, unfortunately, the very children who are left behind are traumatized.
Uh-huh.
And the story doesn't end there because a lot of people who migrate also will tell you that they have experienced trauma, a different type of called trauma that we
Uh-huh.
call collective trauma,
Mm-hmm.
like racism. You,
Uh-huh.
you come into a new country and I mean, you're coming from the Caribbean and you're not accustomed to the racism and
Uh-huh.
the discrimination, and you
Mm-hmm.
see it playing out. I mean, as Black people, we migrate, we end up in poorer communities,
Mm-hmm.
we areas where there's a lot of crime. The schools are you don't have your children don't have access to the better schools, and day in day out you have to deal with the discrimination and the racism and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
That also is very traumatic.
Yes. That's it.
Yes.
Right. Right.
And but as people who want to get ahead and to go ahead in life, we every day we get up and we we get going and we sometimes ignore it, and we work hard and we keep going because we have to save our money to get a nice house and probably to relocate to Florida or to build our dream house back in Jamaica or the Bahamas or St. Vincent or Trinidad. And we keep going, sometimes not realizing how this experience is traumatic for us. And
Yes.
most importantly, how traumatic it can be for our children.
Yes. Yes.
And the sad thing about it, while we're working so hard to create a better life, we're working hard to send home the barrel with the clothes and the food
Mm-hmm.
and to
Mm-hmm.
send back the money.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's sometimes we don't have time to just pause and just recognize what is happening to ourselves and our children
I
and
yes.
so on. And then it's when that child gets out of control, or the child gets involved in criminal activity, child runs afoul with the law, that we begin to realize what is on us. And so,
Mhm.
and the thing about it, as Caribbean people, we do not like therapy,
Oh,
right?
I was gonna get to that. I
when
was
we
about to get
when
to
we
that.
realize that there are problems in the family, problems with our
Mhm.
children, sometimes what we do is that we curse them off, we further traumatize them. Sometimes we take them and put them on a plane and send them back to home,
Yes,
right?
I
Because we can't deal with them, to hide them, or we can't just deal with them. And that it in itself, putting them on a plane and sending them back home, can be very traumatic.
mhm.
Yes. And so what I'm saying to us is that this lecture is not only for those of us in Jamaica alone, it's for all of us in the diaspora, because we all experience trauma. Granted, not all of us who experience trauma will feel its impact, but we just need to recognize that we're exposed to trauma day in, day out. And especially for our children, as I said before, who are vulnerable, we need to ensure that they get care, that
Yes.
when you realize that your child is crying out, or you pick up that there's something wrong with your child, I appeal to all of us, please ensure that you seek care and early care for your children. Good therapy. Yes, and sometimes in this setting that we operate, you want to make sure that it's a therapist who understands your culture, a therapist who can speak your language and
Yes.
understand your culture, because it makes a difference in terms of how they're able to relate to you, relate
Mhm.
to your family, and to relate to your child and your children.
Doctor, Professor, I do not know when they started having counselors in schools in Jamaica.
Mm,
But I do know that when I was going to primary school and high school, I never knew what a school counselor was.
yes,
Okay. So
that's true. That's true that many schools didn't have. I went to Ulmos in the 70s, and I suppose because it was probably one of those better resource schools, we had guidance counselors in our schools. So I grew up being aware of that. But yes, the vast majority of schools didn't have counselors. But I'm happy to say that in today's Jamaican, in today's Caribbean society, increasingly more and more, we're seeing counselors in schools and so on.
yes, and I'm happy to hear that because when you consider
But look here, the problem is not only about what is happening back home.
no, no, no,
Because
no.
you have the very same problem where you are
Well, that is
listening to the to the program today, because wherever you are, you may have counselors, but sometimes these counselors are not culturally sensitive. They don't understand our culture very well, and they're not able to provide the level of care and understanding and support to our families and our children. So it's a problem that exists everywhere.
well, this country leads the world in mass shootings, Professor,
Yes.
and most of them sometimes are taking place in schools.
Mhm.
Okay, so yes, it is.
And the perpetrators are troubled, in
Yes,
many instances, troubled individuals, and persons who themselves might have been exposed to trauma in their lives.
you know
And that
the
is why it's so important for us to discuss trauma. Another area I want to touch on is how slavery has impacted on us because slavery, is what we call a historical trauma.
Mhm.
It affects, for those of us coming from the Caribbean and African Americans, it's it was an experience that we were subjected to for centuries.
Mhm.
Yes, hundreds of years. And people may ask, but why are you still talking about it? And we have to, because if you look at how it has affected us, it has exposed us to poverty. That's why many of us have to leave,
Mhm.
right? Our societies, high levels of violence and trauma associated with slavery. Adults were beaten and flogged in slavery for not working hard enough, and not to mention children who were overworked. Families were destroyed. Children were ripped apart from their mothers and their fathers
Mhm.
and sent to work on other plantation.
Yes.
Fathers were ripped away from their children and they never had the opportunity to be involved in the upbringing of their child or their children. And then when this habit passes across generation and we still see the fathers not being absent, we beat upon them,
Mm.
not knowing that these are behaviors that were carried over from
Yes.
slavery.
Yes.
The act of beating our children harshly has come out of that. That's to a great extent slavery experience, because slavery was brutal, and it was brutal, and it was vicious, and it was harsh. Mothers, it's often said that um, people of African descent, but from our background, we don't show a lot of emotion to our children. And can you imagine in slavery, you have a child or children, and you know that when they reach a certain age, somebody is going to come and take them away from you. And the
Yes.
way you protect yourself is not to get too emotionally connected to that child. And
Mhm.
it's not that we're not caring and so on. It's how what slavery has done to us. And people are going to ask, but slavery ended years ago. It may have, but you know that we carry the trauma and the traumatic experiences from slavery in our genes.
Yes.
We
That's right.
do. There's something called epigenetics, and I'll repeat it, epigenetics. And this explains how our experiences, this is why trauma or your lifestyle or diet can affect you, it when you are exposed to certain things like trauma, it changes how the genes in our body are expressed.
Mhm.
Trauma can shut off or turn on certain genes in our body. And this can be passed on from one generation
Ah,
to
yes.
another.
That's right.
Sometimes, we talk about family curse passing through a generation. That
Uh-huh.
that is sometimes how it explained. So the experiences that your grandparents and great grandparents had many years ago can be passed on in your dreams, and it affects your behavior. So you see
Mhm.
some people aggressive and they say, but boy, these people come from an aggressive family. And a
Uh-huh.
lot of times it's because there was trauma in that family and it's
Mhm.
passed on in the genes.
Yeah, fishermen like to become fishermen, warriors, children become warriors. And in this civilized age, politicians, children become politicians. And what I would like you to take a look at is now the impact it has now on the other colors now, get away from the dark colors, to the denial and the guilt that now
Well,
persists.
yeah,
Go ahead, sir.
tr- true, but I'm not an expert in that area in terms of how it impacts other people, especially outside of the Caribbean. So it's not something I really want to
Okay.
discuss,
Okay.
except that I just want to talk about the experiences of our people. And
Mhm.
I tell you this on a personal level. That's why I left the USA and I was studying there. As I said, I worked for a short while, but at some point in time, I decided to return home. I was a young black male at the time, much younger,
Mhm.
of course.
Uh-huh.
And I encountered the racism and the discrimination on a daily basis. And
Mhm.
I thought to myself, I said, something, I don't have to live with this. I don't have the skill set to navigate this on a daily basis. And I took a conscious decision to return home. That's me. Other persons may not be in a similar position to do that, but that's a decision I took. But I just want to reach out to people who are listening on to let them be aware that these experiences are real and we have to deal with them on a daily basis. But we have to think about our children who experience these traumatic events every day in, day out. And we have to be able to recognize it and to be able to work with them, to protect them, and to ensure that we don't re traumatize them in the process.
Okay. Now, how about what I mean the ripple effects now on things like domestic violence, high murder rates, corruption. I mean, how do you see that ripples into that in impact in our community?
Well, it has to do with, as I said to you, children grow up. Well, first of all, let me tell you this, and I probably should have mentioned this earlier. All the research has shown that what protects children in situations like this is having a trusting relationship with an adult in your life, whether
Okay.
it's your parents, grandparents,
Mm-hmm.
family member, teacher, somebody at church. Having a trusting, healthy relationship
Yes.
protects children from a lot of these traumatic experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very important that children grow up in homes and in environments that they feel safe, that they feel secure and they feel nurtured. Children need stability. They need to be in a safe, secure, stable, and nurturing environment, and that will protect them. That is highly protective. And so I appeal to parents listening on and grandparents and family members, ensure that your children are in an environment where they're safe. And it's not only just the home environment, but the wider community environment where they are safe and secure. Right. That's probably one of the most important protective factors. But let me get back to your question in which um, how does this violence, um, how does it carry on? And as I said before, right, that trauma can be passed on from one generation to another. So um, um, father is aggressive, violent. It passed on in the genes to a child, and that child take, apart from the fact that you may just imitate, copy the behavior of your father, but also it's passed down in your genes through this epigenetic process, and you become aggressive. You develop certain behavior traits that you saw your father, your grandparents having, or your mother, right? And you carry on, you perpetrate this sort of behavioral pattern, yes?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how it's transmitted. And that is what accounts for high levels of violence in let me speak for Jamaica, for example, in Jamaican communities. But you also see it in also communities in North America, right? Especially where you have concentration of African Americans and so on. And a lot of that is linked to intergenerational violence and our experience coming out of slavery and so on, you
Mm-hmm.
know? So, people who are hurt will also hurt people. And that's part of the reality.
So do you think after a while, therefore, trauma becomes embedded in a culture? For example, when you look at when you talk about,
Absolutely.
okay,
Absolutely. I mean, the truth.
the mafia, the mafia,
Trauma.
the mafia, okay, people seem to accept their actions as expected in some
Yes.
instances.
Yes, some of it is learned behavior, but a lot of it is also passed on through the genes. And so you'll find out father engaging that sort of behavior, son engages in that behavior, and the grandson, that offspring that is born, take on that behavior, right? It's only acquired through learning. You copy what you see, but also children. learn what they live,
Yeah.
and they live what they learn, but also it's passed on in the genes, and that's part of the reality, you know. So
Oh,
so I'm coming back to part of our discussion in terms of how we address these issues.
mhm.
I mean, it has to be addressed from different perspective, like in many communities and societies where we have experienced high levels of trauma, um, we develop normalized attitude towards crime and violence and trauma. And you see it a lot in terms of even the popular music. A
Ah,
lot of people contend that they don't like to hear the dancehall because it's too violent.
mhm.
Yes. Because the popular music kind of glamorizes violence and so on, and we have to deal with it. It's something that we have to shut down and say, look, this is not good for our children. We don't want them to grow up in this kind of culture of violence. And in part of my lecture, I'm going to actually make a call for also a values and attitude um, program that we have to, this was a call made previously by a former prime minister here in Jamaica for us to have a values and attitude um, program so that we can have the discussions and embark on a program where we change our fundamental values and attitudes towards violence and those sort of things, and where we through a process change fundamental attitudes so that we no longer have a society where we're exposing our children to a lot of traumatic experiences like violence and so on.
So you want to build an infrastructure now to deal with it.
Absolutely. And
Do you,
infrastructure is not about buildings, it's about
people?
how we people, how we
Yes.
change our mindset and our
Mhm.
behaviors and our attitudes, yes, and our values as a society.
Where do,
Also, add to this process,
mhm.
I will add to the call for reparation because I spoke about the vicious impact of slavery on our society and how it has exposed us to high levels of trauma over centuries, trauma that has been transmitted across generation. And there's a call for part of the whole call for reparation is for us to the people who the perpetrators, the people who carried out the harm must one acknowledge the harm that's been caused over generation, um, apologize for it, and thirdly, they need to make amends, yes, for the harms that have been caused. And when you talk about reparation, it's not only just in terms of money, but it can be sometimes funding programs to help children in inner city communities or supporting schools, especially in vulnerable communities and so on. And we have seen examples of this where in St. Thomas here, where a family in the UK whose ancestors actually owned a plantation in an area in St. Thomas in Jamaica, they actually, as part of their reparation, have taken a decision to contribute to that community and help with the development of the school and so on and so on. And that is noble. That's a fine example of reparation. It's when we talk about repairing, it's really about repairing the harm. We may never be able to fully repair that harm, but at least we can do something to repair that harm.
Well, that went along with the comment I made earlier about the guilt and the denial. Because yes, because I think in the long run, we find that some of the growing racism that we have right now is driven by the call for reparations, where people are saying, well, we never kept slaves, so why are you asking us to do contribute to this idea of reparations, not understanding that they have gotten the full benefit in their DNA carried down. Okay. But at the same time, the denial is like we never did it. Okay. So how can the schools, well, listen, in America, there's a denial now of teaching Black history. Why do you think that is? Do you think that is because they really want to um, contribute to the denial of the reparations question call, as well as the churches, or can the churches impact this trauma that is embedded in our community?
Well, we have to, talking about the churches, we have to acknowledge, and it's commendable that the Anglican Church, which was the major church during slavery, they have now, I mean, just a few years ago, the head of the Anglican Church actually acknowledged the harm caused by slavery and also apologized. As to whether they'll make some amends, we're yet to see. But that is also very commendable. That people have acknowledged the harm that has been done to our people for generations, and which obviously has contributed to the high level of poverty, the health problems, the social problems that we have to now deal with in today's society. But unfortunately, I just have to go because my voice is
I
actually
can
going.
pick up on that. Well,
Mm.
Professor, let me thank you so much for spending the time to update our community, and especially from my point of view, our diaspora, as to how we can now play a role in facing and in dealing with the trauma that some of us left behind us and some of us have brought forward with us. Okay?
And,
Because,
and and have to deal with on a daily basis, you
and
know?
yes, have to deal with on a daily basis, recognizing that just our presence here as immigrants has introduced us into a trauma society, because the racism and the lack of cultural, um, I would say cultural benefit or acceptance creates trauma without you actually identifying it in that sense as trauma. So let me thank you so much, sir, for spending the time here on our network. And I look forward to having a further conversation with you when your voice allows. Thank you so much,
And,
sir.
and, and remember to encourage your listeners to join us live because
Yes.
the lecture will be streamed.
Yes, and this will be on April 2nd. It will be streamed on the Grace Kennedy YouTube channel.
Yes, and just want to say to everybody, one love and walk good.
Thank you so much, sir, and walk good. Professor Elders also put together a valuable resource for educators, guidance counselors, and policymakers, a textbook that covers the lecture. And also on April 2nd, you will be able to download his lecture series on the Grace Kennedy's website at www.gracekennedy.com. www.gracekennedy.com. You will be able to download the professor's lecture. Thank you so much.